all. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Jim Belk, I will say, did a great job of setting this up, and everybody else for us. Frank, we're glad to have you here. It's a brand new facility. We moved in the 15th of March, I think it was. We had our first meeting here at the first week in April, and you all are the first ones for a nighttime meeting. And we would really seriously like some feedback from you on how you like the facilities and what we could do to do things better, because we hope to host a few more of these. A little history on ANSA, very short. We're a public service, not-for-profit, public service research corporation. We've been around a while. We've been here since 1958, as a matter of fact. And we do contract research mainly for the DoD. What's our specialties? Homeland Security. That's something new we've gotten in over the last few years. But we've been in acquisition management, I'll say support, forever. Okay, all the way from concept development right through to retirement of the system. A quickie on ANSA, that's all I'm going to say, and introduce Forrest Pratt, the President of Potomac Chapter, and let him take over.
Thank you, Gene. As you know, my name is Forrest Frank, and it's a great privilege and honor for me to be here this evening to welcome you and our speaker, Mr. James Bamford, who will be introduced in a moment by our Vice President for Programs, Bill Horn. I'd like to draw your attention to the presence of the C-SPAN camera, because this presentation will be televised, I think, on a delay basis. Some of us are sensitive to imagery, and those of us who are uncomfortable being on an image are welcome to join me in the back right-hand corner, where we will be behind and out of camera range. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Gene and Jim Belk and all the other fine folks here at ANSER for welcoming us into their wonderful new conference facility. This is a delightful place to be here. Great time, and wish you much success, sir, in your future endeavors. Just a couple of business items. The next chapter event will be a luncheon on May 17th. On Sunday, May 20th, will be the National Awards Banquet. I hope all of you will be able to attend. You will also note at the entrance to this facility is a flyer announcing the 1991 Open Source Solutions Conference. NMIA members are offered a 10% discount from appropriate fees. And I'd encourage those of you who aren't going to be there with Bill Horn helping to try and attend if possible. This is a wonderful event. It's very worthwhile, and Robert Steele, who is the organizer of this event, always rewards our chapter with a substantial contribution for our volunteer help. It is contributions such as that we get from Robert that enable us to host an event like this tonight. We're delighted and encourage everyone to participate. Later in the evening, we will announce the results of our chapter elections. I don't think we have them exactly yet. Anyone who hasn't yet voted, please see Lori, and we'll be happy to give you a chance to participate. Also, at the conclusion of this evening's presentation, those of you who promised to pay by credit card, would you please see Mr. Golden? Will you raise your hand? Our credit card machine has arrived. Now, if you don't see him, he's going to see you, as will Mr. Belk. And yeah, I got to tell you, Belk retired from the Air Force intelligence world, and I can't tell you what he did, but I don't think it'd be good if you haven't paid. On that note, let me introduce, if I may, our Vice President for Programs, Mr. Bill Horn.
Thank you, Forrest. It's my pleasure to have the honor of introducing Jim Bamford. Might mention that at the conclusion of this period, after Mr. Bamford answers some questions, we will leave this conference room. We'd like to all clear out so the cleaners can go to work in here and go out where the food and drink are, and the books. And there'll be some more books available for sale, and also more autographs given, which it looks like we got way ahead of it on the books already. So it's a pretty good deal. The words of Mr. Bamford are his own, And so NMIA takes no position on the accuracy or the factual basis of his presentation. But we are very pleased at this time to have such a honored author who we think has written an important book that will have a real impact in the dialogue in this country on the intelligence business. James Bamford, having just completed The Body of Secrets, The Anatomy of the Ultra-Secret NSA, from the Cold War to the Dawn of the New Century, published by Doubleday. This is a sequel to his award-winning The Puzzle Palace, which made him a reputation both welcome and unwelcome within the intelligence community, depending on where you sat in this situation, but certainly earned him a place as one of the authorities writing on the National Security Agency and on national security subjects. James Bamford was for 9 years until 1998 Washington investigative producer for ABC News, World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. He was responsible for long-term, in-depth investigative stories from concept to final airing. Wide range of topics included from the White House scandals to locating spies in Cold War Europe to finding murderers in the Middle East. Many involved complicated investigations in difficult areas of the world, such as locating principal figures involved in the Clinton campaign's finance scandal, hiding in China. He is a recipient of numerous TV reporting awards, including the Overseas Press Club Award for Excellence, the Society for Professional Journalists Deadline Award for the Best Investigative Reporting on TV. He has written on investigative topics for many national magazines, including cover stories for the New York Times Magazine on Iran-Contra, Washington Post Magazine on the shoot-down of the KAL 007 flight, the Los Angeles Times Magazine on the Mafia. He's got another one coming out, the New York Times book review for this next Sunday, as his book as the lead item here. I'm told it's a very favorable review. He has written dozens of op-ed pieces and book reviews for the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Some of you may have seen him on TV or heard him on radio here just in the last several days, because he's certainly getting around. I've heard him twice on lengthy interviews. He's testified on intelligence and security issues before committees of the Senate and the House of Representatives. It is with great pleasure and anticipation that I welcome James Bamford.
I want to thank Bill, and a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And Gene, I want to thank you for the hospitality of having this session here and let me speak here in your beautiful building. And Forrest, thanks very much for having me as speaker on your organization. It's terrific. Writing about NSA and secret parts of government, benefits and deficits. When I did The Puzzle Palace, the problem was when I wrote the book, almost nobody knew what NSA was when I wrote it. My editors at Hope Mifflin at the time thought I was writing a novel at first. I think it was 6 months into it that they began to realize this is a real agency I'm writing about. One of the funny things was when I was on my book tour after The Puzzle Palace came out, one of the people that I had to share a car with going to one of the TV sessions was Bill Bradley, Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey. And in the back of the taxi, he said, what's your book about? And I said, it's about NSA, the National Security Agency. And he said, what's that? So I spent the rest of the taxi ride explaining what the largest intelligence agency was. When we got on the TV show, he went first. He was talking about the economy, and then they asked me about NSA, and the first question was, how secret is it? How secret is NSA? And I just couldn't resist it. I said, even Senator Bradley said he'd never heard of it. And so he got very angry after that. I think I had to take a separate taxi back. And his aide called me up the next day and said that was a very low blow. And I said, no, I was just telling the truth. I said, if I wanted a low blow, I would have said he confused it with the NBA. But also when the book came out, there was every author wants to get on the Book of the Month Club. So you look at the back of the New York Times where they put your little picture of your book, tiny little picture of it. And so Book of the Month Club picked my book, and I looked at the back of the New York Times book review, and there it was. But they had changed something. It said, instead of saying a report on NSA, America's most secret agency, they changed it and said a report on NASA, America's most secret agency. Because the ad company thought I had made a mistake on the jacket of my book, and they voluntarily changed it for me. So. At least the NSA is a little bit better known now. One of the other problems I had, when the book came out, they went to, I'd go into a bookstore and ask, if my book is there, and sometimes I go around and look to see if the book is where it should be, and if I don't see it, I'd ask for it, see if it's in the bookstore. And one of the things that used to bother me was when I didn't see it and I go ask for it, and the clerk would say, well, yes, we have 4 copies of it. And I'd say, where is it? And they'd say, it's in the puzzle section. So I definitely changed the name of the book this time, The Body of Secrets. And the problem I had this time, however, was I tried to be a little cute. It was Body of Secrets, and then Anatomy of America's Ultra-Secret NSA, and then all the chapter titles are body parts. Brain for all about the computers, heart about the internal workings of NSA, and so forth. And then I began running out of body parts, and I didn't know what chapter to name, gallbladder or something like that. So. But this time it was a little bit different. NSA was a lot more cooperative, and they opened the door a crack for me to take a peek in, and Director Hayden was very nice and gave me a number of interviews and tours and all that type of thing, and they're even having a book signing for me up at NSA tomorrow, so it's a different reaction than the last time. So I guess the end of the Cold War and a number of years sort of mellows everybody. Let me just tell you a little bit about what this book's about. First of all, I wanted to, there's been a lot of books on World War II, the Ultra and breaking of the Purple Code and all that. So I wanted to start on the day World War II ended, basically. And what I started with was very interesting. It's something that few people ever knew about. And what happened was that as the war was coming to an end, you had all these cryptologists who were in Bletchley Park and watched the war vicariously, like voyeurs almost, through the messages of the enemy. And then, as the war was coming to an end, the decision was made to take a lot of these cryptologists from the monastery there in Bletchley Park and put them right in the front lines, which really surprised a lot of them. They had some of these people going out for gun practice, and they weren't very good at shooting guns. And they were very nervous about being parachuted into the front lines. But the whole idea behind this operation was called TICOM, which is short for Target Committee. And the idea was a joint committee between, or joint project between the British and the Americans. And the idea was to fly the cryptologists to the front lines, drop them in there, and have them capture as many code machines, cipher machines from the Germans as possible, and as many cryptologists from the German cryptologists as possible. And the reason for that, they had 2 principal reasons for doing that. One was to get there before the Russians got there, because if they figured that the Germans were able to break U.S. or British ciphers, they wanted to get there and get those machines and get those people before the Russians got in and found it. And the second reason was to capture whatever the Germans might have in terms of breaking Russian ciphers, because they knew that they had been working on Russian ciphers for quite a while. So they weren't able to parachute into the front lines because the war started disintegrating towards the end, and they so they rode in on jeeps and trucks to pretty much the front lines. And they had one major, they had a lot of discoveries. One of the things they discovered was that the Germans never did break any major U.S. ciphers, which made them very happy. A couple low-level ciphers, a couple lower naval ciphers they broke, but none of the major ciphers. So they felt fairly confident about their about U.S.'s own cipher system. Then they went after the Germans to find out what they knew about the Russian system, and they were very successful about that. They found these German prisoners in one of the Allied prison camps who worked on cipher machines and so forth. And during an interrogation, they told them that they had broken the Russian principal cipher, one of their high-level ciphers, and that they know where the machine is that broke it. The machine had been hidden under the ground, under the front of one of the German buildings. So the American and British cipher people went there and dug it up, and it was a huge machine. It filled up 4 10-ton trucks, a giant machine, and they set it up, and they had the Germans there show them how to work it, and lo and behold, they had managed to find a key to breaking the Russian cipher very early on, which was very lucky because he never even attacked it, never even tried to break it during the entire war, with the small exception of this Venona project, which was very small and only had to do with the number of messages previously intercepted and mostly had to do with the KGB code and so forth. So this was a major advance for the code breakers in the U.S. and Britain. And that lasted until 1948. And then in 1948, everything just went silent. And NSA's ears went totally deaf at that point, because the Russians had managed to have a spy in the predecessor to NSA at the time. And that spy gave away the key secrets to that machine that the predecessor to NSA was using to break the codes. So at that point, the Russian government ordered that no more signals be sent through the air, that landlines be used, and made major improvements in its cipher system. And throughout most of the 1950s, the NSA was basically deaf in terms of trying to eavesdrop on high-level Russian ciphers. President Eisenhower in the late 50s became very worried about it, and I got documents from the Eisenhower Library that have been recently declassified where he's talking about the problem, and he's right in the Oval Office. He's saying, we've got to break the Russian code and so forth. And he started this Project Lightning, which was one of the largest government-financed projects in history up to that time in terms of building up the U.S. computer strength. And that was going to be the key to helping to break some of these Russian ciphers. So the American computer industry got a major, the pump for the computer industry got primed with this Project Lightning. A great deal of money went into it. And the American computer industry really took off after that. During the early 60s, I write about basically the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there have been dozens of books written on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but not one even mentions NSA during what role NSA played. If you see that recent movie, 13 Days, the NSA gets mentioned once during the entire movie. But NSA did play a major role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, although those secrets have never come out. So I'm writing about them basically for the first time in my book, a lot of them. And it was a really interesting period because the U.S. had listening posts all around the Soviet Union, and were picking up indications of when they were sending ships out. And the ships would try to mask where they were going. They would send out signals saying we're leaving from Black Sea and going to Africa or something. But then through high-frequency direction finding, they'd find the ships aren't going to Africa, they were going to Cuba. And a lot of times they'd be, on their official broadcast, be lying about what was being loaded in terms of cargo, but NSA was able to pick up what the real cargo was in a lot of the ships. And all of a sudden, they had all these passenger ships going to Cuba, loaded with thousands of passengers, when most Russians can't get out to take vacations in Cuba very often. So they figured these were all the people going to work on the missiles and so forth. So NSA played a large role in terms of getting the government's attention, the administration's attention, to looking at Cuba. It was the Air Force actually flying a U-2 that picked up the first indications of the first photos of the missiles. But NSA had a major ship, the USS Oxford, sitting right off Havana Harbor. It was only 6 miles off Havana Harbor, and it would just go back and forth. And the Cubans knew exactly what it was there for, and they would harass it a lot of times. They'd fly planes low, or they'd send torpedo boats out and point their guns at the ship and try to intimidate it. And the people on the ship were, you know, trying to pick up as many signals as possible, and they knew it was a hazardous area. But at one point, they picked up a key signal, and that was the activation of one of the missiles. I mean, we knew that they had missiles before, but once they heard the signal from the missile, from the warhead, basically, they knew that the missiles were activated at that moment, which was another milestone. And NSA actually flew a helicopter over and picked up the tape and got it back to NSA right away. During one of the hairiest times for the crew members, I interviewed quite a few of the crew members, was during Kennedy's broadcast that night, because they didn't really have a sense of how really how dangerous it was. And then they heard live on the radio the Kennedy address, and they're looking out their portholes and seeing Havana Harbor only 6 miles away, and they were getting very nervous, since if the war ever came, they were the first ones that were going to go. But they played an important role during that entire period, a role that really hasn't been talked about much. So I get into that quite a bit in the book. From there, I go into Vietnam. NSA's role in Vietnam has never been written about. And it took a lot of research, because NSA is just starting to sort of declassify some of that. But it's an important role. The very first person ever killed in Vietnam and during the Vietnam War was an Army signals intelligence person trying to do direction finding. I think it was 1961. The reason the U.S. committed itself very heavily was because of NSA to a large degree. It was during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, for example. The Gulf of Tonkin incident came about because one of the ships, the USS Maddox, was a eavesdropping ship. It was a ship just collecting signals along the coast of Vietnam. And at the same time, the ship was cruising up and down and collecting signals. The U.S. was sponsoring these attacks along the coast, and the North Vietnamese connected the two. They thought that the ships were directing these attacks on the coast, and to some degree, that's what the United States wanted them to do, because then they would be able to get a lot more signals. The problem was, by connecting the Maddox with the attacks on the shore, the North Vietnamese then came out and attacked the Maddox at one point, or they attempted to attack it. They missed at on the first attempt, and then about 2 days later, after that first attempt, the U.S. put another ship, an escort ship, there to protect it. It was called the Turner Joy, and about 2 days later, a day and a half later or so, the Maddox got an emergency message from NSA saying that they're about to be attacked. And that night was very foggy, and the Maddox and the Turner Joy began seeing all these images on their radar scopes indicating that attacks are taking place and torpedoes are being shot at the ship and so forth. It wasn't until, and after that, President Johnson got very upset, and that's when the Congress passed almost unanimously the Gulf of Tonkin resolution based on these incidents. But it wasn't until years later that it was discovered that that message, that most important message, the warning message that went out to the Maddox, was a mistake. That message was about the previous attack 2 days earlier, and the message just went out late. So there never was a message indicating that they were about to be attacked the second night. And it was later determined that most of what they were seeing on those radar scopes, because it was a foggy night and all that, were sort of ghost images. So no attack ever took place that second night. But that was what basically led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. So NSA played a major role inadvertently in the entire launching of the U.S. Formal entry into the war. During the Vietnam War, it was the NSA played a major role in trying to eavesdrop on virtually all the signals in Vietnam. They had people on the ground that would do direction finding, trying to find out where the Viet Cong were, and it was an extremely dangerous job. And that's the job that this Sergeant Davis, who was the first person killed, was doing at the time. And then it was like a wedding cake in terms of the way the eavesdropping was done over Vietnam. You had the people on the ground, then you had another level, which was the helicopters, and then small 1- and 2-engine planes, and then the 4-engine eavesdropping planes, SIGINT planes, and eventually you get up to they had U-2s that were flying off the coast, and they would be monitoring signals, and it was a very boring job for the U-2 pilots, because unlike when they're flying the photo missions and they're actually flying over things and taking pictures and snapping, turning things on and off, with the SIGINT missions, they were basically just a relay station. And so they'd fly these circular patterns over the Gulf of Tonkin and pick up the signals and then just relay them to a downlink down in a safe area of South Vietnam. So you had, and then above the U-2s were the SR-71s that would fly in from Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. And they leave in the morning and fly their mission and fly back, and they're back in time for lunch. And their entire time, I think it was over Vietnam, and that's back and forth, was only 12 minutes. And they were able to collect an enormous amount of signals. And then there was still the RC-135, which was like a vacuum cleaner that picked up all these signals. And then they had drones that were picking up more signals. So there was a huge effort to do this. One of the problems, one of the major factors for U.S. Losses in Vietnam, however, was the opposite side of the coin. Senior U.S. military officials there were pretty sloppy when it came to communication security. The NSA did a huge report on this entire problem. It was called deadly transmissions. And that's what it was, because a lot of the signals, there was a lot of misunderstanding about the sophistication of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. You know, they saw these people wearing these tire treads for sandals and so forth. So a lot of the senior military didn't think they'd be very sophisticated. But eventually, when they started discovering some of these hideouts that they had, they found reams of transcripts of high-level U.S. military communications, because a lot of military commanders were too lazy to use encryption systems. They used the regular open telephone, which was heavily penetrated by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. So in addition to that, the Russians had a ship sitting off, an intelligence collection ship sitting off Guam at the time we were flying the B-52s. And NSA did a survey around Guam after a while and began finding out they're picking up a lot of signals. And the pilots, when they were transmitting information on the way to Vietnam, that information was being picked up also. So there were a lot of, not only a lot of times when the B-52s ended up bombing areas where there was nobody there because the Viet Cong had found out about it earlier. There were times when the Vietnamese actually turned the tables and found out U.S. Access codes, or a lot of times there were no access codes to some of the military activities, and they would make up, or they'd find out what the code words were and pretend they were a U.S. Somebody in the Army, and they'd send a helicopter to go to a place that where they had an ambush waiting. So the communication security was a very critical part of the whole Vietnam War. It was a critical part for the Vietnamese doing as well as they did, and it was a critical part for the U.S. Losses in a lot of occasions. During the latter stages of the war, well, let me just move to the basically the last days of the war, which was very interesting. I was able to get from NSA a great deal of the intercepts. They weren't really intercepts, but the last days of the war when Saigon was falling, you had a task force out in the Tonkin Gulf that was waiting for a lot of the people who were leaving the embassy to fly by a helicopter out to the ships and so forth. But the commander of the task force was to a large degree blind of what was going on at the embassy at the time and what was taking place. So they asked NSA to basically monitor embassy communications and then pass all the basically intercepts on to the commander of the task force. And I quote from a lot of those intercepts in the book, and it's a fascinating tale of the last hours of Saigon and the last hours of that embassy there, because what you're doing is you're listening to the actual words of what's happening as the whole embassy complex is collapsing and how they're trying to get the ambassador out. And the only reason we're able to determine this is from the messages that NSA was forwarding to the commands. The NSA had a major disaster at the very end, one of its biggest disasters, I think, in its history. One of the things that well, at the embassy, they did very well in trying to destroy all the equipment and so forth before the city fell. But as the war was coming to an end, the U.S. tried to get a lot of the encryption equipment back from the South Vietnamese because they had let them use some of the NSA's sophisticated encryption equipment during the war. And actually during the period 1970 to 75 also. But then as 1975 came along, that's the date when Saigon fell in April of 1975. For about 6 months before that, they began trying to get all this encryption equipment back from the South Vietnamese government because they didn't want it to fall in the hands of the North Vietnamese government. And they did a good job of accounting for it and getting it all back. And then they put it in this warehouse at Tan Son Nhut Airport, and it was right next to the Armed Forces Courier Station, which was going to take all the equipment back. Well, unfortunately, the city fell before they were able to get all that equipment back. So there were about 700 pieces of pristine, high-level NSA cipher equipment that the Vietnamese captured when they captured the city, and which is probably the largest single loss of encryption equipment in U.S. history. See, I want to take questions, so I don't want to prolong this too long, but I get into a lot of areas. One of the most important areas I get into in the book, I think, is the attack on the U.S.'s liberty. It's a very controversial area because it was during the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel attacked the ship during broad daylight. They sent fighters that shot about 800 rounds into the ship, 800 cannon rounds. They fired rockets into the ship. They dropped bombs on the ship. And they came back and they leveled napalm all over the ship. This is a spy ship, NSA eavesdropping ship. It was 13 miles off the coast of the Sinai when all this took place. The crew, the ship was very lightly armed. There were only defensive machine guns that could only reach about a mile or so. That was the total length of the machine guns. After the aircraft really let the Liberty have it, then a number of, well, there were 3 torpedo boats that came, and they fired a total of 5 torpedoes at the ship. Luckily, only one hit, but that one that hit right in the signals intelligence spaces, killing 25 intercept operators immediately. There were a total of 34 people killed on the ship, 171 wounded. The hole that was blasted into the ship was big enough to drive a bus into. I think it was 44 feet wide or something like that. It was huge. And despite it all, the ship managed to survive. and the Captain McGonigal managed to get the ship back to safety. The question is, what happened during that period of time? Again, this was broad daylight. The Israelis had done a tremendous amount of surveillance of the ship beforehand. They had sent planes going over and coming back, and the crew members, every one of them says that the flags were flying during the entire attack. In addition to that, the names were on the back of the name was on the back of the ship, USS Liberty, and its markings were all on American-style naval markings on the ship. I did a lot of research on this, largely through new NSA documents I was able to obtain. NSA looked into this very extensively. The conclusions of a lot of the people, senior people at NSA, was that it was deliberate, primarily because there was no other possible explanation. The ship was not flying an Egyptian flag. It was not carrying any Egyptian equipment or script on the side. Yet the Israelis said they thought it was an Egyptian ship. And the ship they said they thought it was a ship that had been sitting at a port 200 miles away and had never left during the entire war. And what it was a troop and horse transport, about a third the size of the Liberty. In addition, they said they made a mistake. They thought the Liberty was going 30 knots, and it was outpacing their PT boats. The Liberty at the time was going about between 3 and 5 knots, and its top speed was 17 knots. They said they thought the Liberty was bombarding El Arish, which was a city on the Sinai Desert, about 13 miles away. The guns on the Liberty were only these machine guns, which had a total distance of 1 mile. So there are all these explanations that made no sense. In addition, one of the things I discovered was that at the time the Liberty was off the coast of the Sinai, there were massive war crimes taking place on the Sinai Desert. The Israelis were killing Egyptian prisoners by the hundreds. And this has been reported not only in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but the Israeli papers, because the historians, the Israeli military historians, have come out and told about this. They wrote a report on these massacres right after the event, and then the Israeli government covered it up. So what you have was all this activity taking place on the Sinai. You had an eavesdropping ship 13 miles away that the Israelis knew about because they had flown all the surveillance missions. And even one of the naval officers in the naval command said that he had identified the Liberty through Jane's fighting ship and passed on that identification. So the bottom line was that Israel did an investigation. They prosecuted nobody. They demoted nobody. Most of the people involved eventually went on to high careers and so forth. The U.S. never did any investigation whatsoever. They had a couple small inquiries into the problems with the communications, getting messages to and from the Liberty. They had a naval court of inquiry that looked into the performance of the sailors on the ship, whether they performed well and so forth. But the U.S. government never did one investigation into why this happened. Unlike the USS Cole, for example, which, the day after it happened, there were plane loads of FBI agents flying to Yemen. This never had it, and there were twice as many people killed in this incident. Congress never held an investigation. I mean, Congress can spend weeks looking into why people were fired in a travel office in the White House, but they can't look into why 34 people in a U.S. ship was virtually destroyed. So anyway, this came under my purview as writing about NSA. It was the worst loss of life in NSA history. And the conclusions I come up with are the U.S. should have an investigation. Even 34 years later, we should look into what happened. It's only fair for the families of the victims and the survivors who are still alive. And in the chapters, I go also into the problems that are cropping up now, which is NSA going deaf? Is NSA starting to lose its hearing because of all the changes in technology? I also discuss the question of echelon, this whole thing that has the Europeans upset, whether NSA is eavesdropping on foreign countries and so forth. Their commercial communications. I was invited to Brussels to speak before the European Union, or the European Parliament on Monday. And I went there and I told them that in 2 books on NSA, and having written more than anybody else, I've never found one indication that NSA picks up information from European companies and passes it on to American companies, which didn't exactly make them very happy, but you know, then they began 2.5 hours of interrogation as though I was the NSA. Why are you sending these eavesdropping on us and so forth? But it was a fun book to write because it was like exploring a lost continent, since hardly anybody had ever traveled on these roads before in terms of writing it. And you know, if you all come back in 20 years, I'll have the 3rd of my trilogy finished about this time. We can speak here again. Anyway, I'd like to take whatever questions we can.
Would you
Yes, sir.
please identify yourself if you wish to, and speak into the microphone so that they can be picked up for rebroadcast.
My name is Scott Palmer, and I'd like to know if what you told us about the interim period after World War II, before NSA, is that covered in your book?
Yes, that's. I start off with that in the book. That's the very first chapter. Yes.
What's the
TICOM.
price of admission?
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, TICOM is still considered very secret by both the U.S. and the British government. The U.S. government wanted to release TICOM, the details of it. And it's a long story, I won't bore you with it, but the British objected to it. And because the British objected to it, the U.S. government has still never officially released documents. The documents I have just happen to be sitting in the NSA Museum Library, so open to anybody that wants to look at them. Yes, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have anything? Oh, Mike. I'm sorry.
Yes, William Horn. Do you have anything on the Pueblo incident? Did you find anything in that area?
Yeah, I did a whole chapter on the Pueblo also. The Pueblo was a ship attacked off, or captured by the North Vietnamese in 1968. North Korean, sorry. Captured by North Korea in 1968, and January of 1968. And one of the interesting things about that, which I discovered, was that that was captured in January of 1968. And having talked to a number of the former KGB people, it was a major success for the Russians, because they were able to capture the machines that were on the Pueblo, just like the Chinese are able to capture all that equipment on the EP-3 now. But when the Chinese, when the North Vietnamese, the North Koreans, when they captured the Pueblo and got the machines off and passed it on to the Russians, they had half the puzzle. The Russians had half the puzzle. They had the machines, but they didn't have the key cards, the things that actually changed the codes every day. So that loss wasn't that important. But what nobody knew for over a decade was that almost at the same time, the previous November, John Walker began passing all the key cards to the Russians. So between the time of 1967 and 1985, the Russians had both the machines and the key cards. So they were able to break a lot of the high-level, or read a lot of the high-level encrypted communications for over a decade because of that. Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you. Patrick Ryan. On the Liberty incident, can you talk a little bit about the reaction among those in the NSA who believed it was a deliberate attack, if they tried to get the story straight or get the story out as they saw it, or if there was any effort to suppress the story? Also, since you've written about it, have you been contacted, or has anyone approached you about the position that you're putting forward, either from the U.S. government or the Israeli government?
The book just came out a couple of days ago, so nobody's approached me really in any way. In terms of the NSA reaction, I interviewed Marshall Carter, the director of NSA, a number of years ago for the Puzzle Palace. I spent 2 days with him interviewing him, and he was gave me a very extensive interview. Most of what I wrote about in the Puzzle Palace. One of the things he did tell me that he didn't want printed at the time was that he believed that it was a deliberate attack. I have it in this book here, in Body of Secrets. Lou Tordella, for example, he wrote an internal memorandum for the record very soon afterwards. And that memorandum has never come out until I write about it in my book here. And he was very, had a lot of foresight, I think. He said that the only explanation he could come up with, basically, was that some commander on the Sinai was doing something he didn't want the U.S. to find out about. General Morrison, who was the head of the operations at NSA at the time, he was actually deputy head of operations at NSA at the time, said there can't be any other explanation. Walter Dealey, who did the investigation for NSA, concluded that the Israelis had to know because of the extensive intelligence they had. There's one thing that just came up that I just discovered basically in the last few weeks, which was very interesting. Matter of fact, it's in Norman Pomar's book here, as a matter of fact, on the U-2. There's a quote in there from from another book called Stalemate, and it was a book written by one of the officials at the embassy in Israel. He was there from 1967 until for about 3 years, I guess it was. And he wrote in his book that he was told by one of the other officials, the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, that in 1970, while the U.S. was flying these patrols, U-2 patrols over the Suez Canal to watch whether either side was violating the treaty, that Moshe Dayan called him over to his office and threatened him by saying that if any of those U-2s slide over in our airspace, we're going to shoot it down. I mean, if that's the mindset that, you know, we catch you doing any spying, we're going to shoot it down. Yes, Norman.
Just a comment, or a question rather. Not a
No, excuse me. Can you go to the mic, please, Norm?
Just a question, not a comment, rather. A commander in the Sinai committing an atrocity, let's give him credit for that, or give him the label of committing an atrocity, was able to call the Israeli Operations Center for the Air Force in Tel Aviv, for the Navy in Haifa, to get both of them to go along with directing fighters and PT boats to attack a ship to cover for him?
Well, what happened was that the original request for this whole attack came from a commander in the Sinai. I mean, even the Israelis admit this. But what they're saying is the commander said, we're being bombarded by a ship out at sea. And that was the reason the Israelis give for launching it originally. Well, how could they be bombarded by the Liberty? It doesn't, you know, it doesn't, its guns couldn't even reach more than a mile, let alone 13, 14, 15 miles to the town of El Arish.
The people identifying them in aircraft were Air Force or Navy personnel?
They were both, I think.
There were no Navy personnel airborne.
Well, maybe not, but the original person that identified it from the Jane's fighting ships was the naval liaison to the Israeli Air Force office, and he passed it on to the deputy chief of naval operations. So, you know, this is the problem is I don't have the money or the time to investigate every last detail of this case. The point I'm trying to make with this chapter is the U.S. government has an obligation to do it, and there's enough. I graduated from law school, and one of the things you learn in law school is when you're building a case, you build up probable cause. Well, there's enough probable cause to show that the Israelis did it deliberately. It's not definitive proof, but I can't, that's not my job, is to come up with definitive proof. Mine is to show that there's probable cause that the U.S. government should conduct its own investigation, which is what I think they should do. One other little point on that was one other thing I found was the Israelis continually said they never saw the American flag, even though every member of the crew said the flag was flying during this entire time. And one of the people I found was and one of the things nobody knew at the time was that the NSA also had a plane flying above the Liberty during the incident. And I talked to the guy who was the chief Hebrew Russian linguist. He was dual language capable. And he said that in the information they picked up from the pilots and also the PT boats, there was mention of the U.S. flag. So that's what he had to say. Yes, Norman.
The Israelis released the gun camera film from the aircraft that made the attack. You might want to check with the embassy and try to get access to it, because the gun camera film, which I've seen, is very interesting because the smoke from the ship is going straight up.
Well, it wasn't going straight up before they attacked it. You got all these pilots there that the USS Liberty is in big letters in the back, and they had the PT boat crew that was there too. So, tell that to the crew. One of the things, the captain of the ship, McGonigal, never said a word about the whether it was deliberate or accidental or who he believed or anything during the entire 34 years. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his courageousness, and then the Johnson administration managed to make an exception in his case and not present it at the White House by the president. They gave it to him in a back room of the Naval Yard by the Secretary of the Navy, again trying to hide this whole thing. Anyway, so during his entire post-naval career, he never said a word about it until he was almost on his deathbed. It was 4 months before he died, and he finally said, I think the Israelis did it deliberately and there needs to be an investigation. That's what these people are saying, and I just agree with them, that there needs to be an investigation. So we could get some definitive answers here, rather than have some hack journalist here go out and find out what he can. I mean, we've got an entire Congress and Federal Bureau of Investigation, everybody else that are supposed to be doing official investigations. But anyway, I really enjoyed being here, and it's a thrill to talk to people in the community. I wish I could be asking you all these questions now. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Have a real impact in the dialogue in this country on the intelligence business. James Bamford, having just completed The Body of Secrets, The Anatomy of the Ultra-Secret NSA, from the Cold War to the dawn of the new century, published by Doubleday. This is a sequel to his award-winning The Puzzle Palace, which made him a reputation both welcome and unwelcome within the intelligence community, depending on where you sat in this situation, but certainly earned him a place as one of the authorities writing on the National Security Agency and on national security subjects. James Bamford was for 9 years until 1998 Washington investigative producer for ABC News, World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. He was responsible for long-term, in-depth investigative stories from concept to final airing. Wide range of topics included from the White House scandals to locating spies in Cold War Europe to finding murderers in the Middle East. Many involved complicated investigations in difficult areas of the world, such as locating principal figures involved in the Clinton campaign's finance scandal, hiding in China. He is a recipient of numerous TV reporting awards, including the Overseas Press Club Award for Excellence, the Society for Professional Journalists Deadline Award for the Best Investigative Reporting on TV. He has written on investigative topics for many national magazines, including cover stories for the New York Times Magazine on Iran-Contra, Washington Post Magazine on the shoot-down of the KAL 007 flight, the Los Angeles Times Magazine on the Mafia. He's got another one coming out, the New York Times book review for this next Sunday, as his book is the lead item here. I'm told it's a very favorable review. He has written dozens of op-ed pieces and book reviews for the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Some of you may have seen him on TV or heard him on radio here just in the last several days, because he's certainly getting around. I've heard him twice on lengthy interviews. He's testified on intelligence and security issues before committees of the Senate and the House of Representatives. It is with great pleasure and anticipation that I welcome James Bamford.
I want to thank Bill, and a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And Gene, I want to thank you for the hospitality of having this session here and let me speak here in your beautiful building. And Forrest, thanks very much for having me as speaker on your organization. It's terrific.
Welcome you all. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Jim Belk, I will say, did a great job of setting this up, and everybody else. Forrest, Frank, we're glad to have you here. It's a brand new facility. We moved in the 15th of March, I think it was. We had our first meeting here at the first week in April, and you all are the first ones for a nighttime meeting. And we would really seriously like some feedback from you on how you like the facilities and what we could do to do things better, because we hope to host a few more of these. A little history on ANSA, very short. We're a public service, not-for-profit, public service research corporation. We've been around a while. We've been here since 1958, as a matter of fact. And we do contract research mainly for the DOD. What's our specialties? Homeland Security. That's something new we've gotten in over the last few years. But we've been in acquisition management, I'll say support, forever. Okay, all the way from concept development right through to retirement of the system. A quickie on ANSA, that's all I'm going to say, and introduce Forrest Frank, the President of Potomac Chapter, and let him take over.
Thank you, Gene. As you know, my name is Forrest Frank, and it's a great privilege and honor for me to be here this evening to welcome you and our speaker, Mr. James Bamford, who will be introduced in a moment by our Vice President for Programs, Bill Horn. I'd like to draw your attention to the presence of the C-SPAN camera, because this presentation will be televised, I think, on a delay basis. Some of us are sensitive to imagery, and those of us who are uncomfortable being on an image are welcome to join me in the back right-hand corner, where we will be behind and out of camera range. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Gene and Jim Belk and all the other fine folks here at ANSER for welcoming us into their wonderful new conference facility. This is a delightful place to be here. Great time, and wish you much success, sir, in your future endeavors. Just a couple of business items. The next chapter event will be a luncheon on May 17th. On Sunday, May 20th, will be the National Awards Banquet. I hope all of you will be able to attend. You will also note at the entrance to this facility is a flyer announcing the 1991 Open Source Solutions Conference. NMIA members are offered a 10% discount from appropriate fees. And I'd encourage those of you who aren't going to be there with Bill Horn helping to try and attend if possible. This is a wonderful event. It's very worthwhile, and Robert Steele, who is the organizer of this event, always rewards our chapter with a substantial contribution for our volunteer help. It is contributions such as that we get from Robert that enable us to host an event like this tonight. We're delighted and encourage everyone to participate. Later in the evening, we will announce the results of our chapter elections. I don't think we have them exactly yet. Anyone who hasn't yet voted, please see Laurie, and we'll be happy to give you a chance to participate. Also, at the conclusion of this evening's presentation, those of you who promised to pay by credit card, would you please see Mr. Golden? Will you raise your hand? Our credit card machine has arrived. Now, if you don't see him, he's going to see you, as will Mr. Belk. And, yeah, I got to tell you, Belk retired from the Air Force intelligence world, and I can't tell you what he did, but I don't think it'd be good if you haven't paid. On that note, let me introduce, if I may, our Vice President for Programs, Mr. Bill Horn.
Thank you, Forrest. It's my pleasure to have the honor of introducing Jim Bamford. Might mention that at the conclusion of this period, after Mr. Bamford answers some questions, we will leave this conference room. We'd like to all clear out so the cleaners can go to work in here and go out where the food and drink are and the books. And there'll be some more books available for sale and also more autographs given, which it looks like we got way ahead of it on the books already. So it's a pretty good deal. The words of Mr. Bamford are his own, and so NMIA takes no position on the accuracy or the factual basis of his presentation. But we are very pleased at this time to have such a honored author who we think has written an important book that will have